There's something about having your own space that brings peace, and for Jack, that space was his garage. It wasn't merely a place to park his car, it was a sanctuary where he stored his tools, tinkered on small projects, and simply relaxed. Every item had its proper place, and nothing ever disturbed the quiet of his afternoons, until Karen decided to park in it. Karen, the self-appointed queen of the neighborhood and president of the local HOA, had a reputation for enforcing rules with an iron fist. She was the kind of person who would knock on a neighbor's door to complain about grass that was 1 millimeter too long or a front door painted in a shade she deemed unacceptable. If there was any rule to be enforced, Karen made sure you knew about it, even if you didn't ask for her input. One ordinary afternoon, when the air was calm and the only sounds were the rustle of wind through trees and the distant hum of traffic, Jack pulled into his driveway. He took a sip of his coffee and nearly choked when he saw a strange SUV parked inside his garage, as if it owned the place. It wasn't his sister's car, it wasn't his neighbor's, and it certainly wasn't his. The most galling detail was that the garage door was wide open, as though the universe itself was spotlighting the absurdity of the situation in broad daylight. Jack had been gone for barely 8 hours, yet in that short time, someone had claimed his private property like a lion marking its territory. At first, Jack wondered if it were a simple mistake, a delivery person perhaps, or an Uber driver who had taken a wrong turn. But as he stepped out of his car and examined the scene, his instincts told him this was something else entirely. The SUV was parked perfectly inside the garage, its doors locked as though the driver had taken great care to position it just right. To top it off, a half-empty iced coffee sat on the hood with condensation still beating down its sides, a clear sign that someone had been there very recently. Jack marched up to his front door, checked that nothing else was amiss, and then went next door to ask around. That was when he met Karen. She appeared even before he could knock, stepping out of her house with a confidence that only someone who had never been challenged could muster. With her short bob haircut and oversized sunglasses, Karen exuded the air of someone who believed the rules applied only to everyone else. "Excuse me," Jack said steadily, trying to keep his tone neutral. "Do you know whose car is in my garage?" Without missing a beat, Karen replied, "Yeah, it's mine." Jack paused, trying to process her words. "I'm sorry, what?" "I parked there," she stated flatly. "I needed the space." Jack's eyes widened in disbelief. He had encountered entitled people before, but Karen's nonchalant admission was astonishing. "So you just parked in my garage?" he asked, making sure he wasn't imagining things. Karen scoffed dismissively. "It was empty, what's the big deal? You weren't even using it." That simple statement sent a surge of anger through Jack. "Karen, this is my property. You can't just park in my garage because you feel like it," he said, his voice tight with controlled fury. "It's trespassing, and you need to move your car, now." "I will move it," she replied coolly, "but not right now. I've got errands to run." Then without further discussion, she turned and walked back inside, shutting her door in his face. Jack stood for a long moment, jaw clenched, trying to understand how someone could be so brazen. He could have called the police, or had her car towed, but the smugness in her dismissal stirred something petty in him. If she wanted to use his garage, then she could deal with the consequences of that choice. Returning inside, Jack grabbed his garage door remote and locked the garage from within. He also secured the side door with a deadbolt, checking twice to ensure that there was no way in or out. With everything sealed up, he packed a small bag and left for a week-long trip he had planned. In his mind, if Karen truly wanted to make herself at home in his garage, she would have to wait, and wait she would. What Jack didn't know was that before he locked up, Karen had actually re-entered his garage, perhaps to retrieve something from her SUV, assuming she could come and go freely. Unbeknownst to him, when he sealed the door, she was trapped inside. By the time Jack reached his vacation destination, enjoying the sun and a cold drink on the beach, Karen discovered the horrible truth: she was locked in his garage with no way out. Inside the cramped space, Karen's situation quickly deteriorated. There was no cell signal, the thick walls muffled any chance of communication, and the only food she found was a couple of stale protein bars tucked away in her purse, and some old crackers in the glove compartment. The small, ill-equipped interior of her SUV offered little comfort. Worse yet, there was no restroom. In a moment of desperate humiliation, she resorted to using an empty Starbucks cup she found in the back seat. At first, Karen believed she might be able to hold out until someone noticed her absence. She banged on the garage door, yelling for help, convinced that the noise would eventually alert a neighbor or that her husband, Greg, would notice. Yet, as hours turned into a full day, her shouts faded into the echo of the closed space. The garage was silent, and her calls for help were swallowed by the oppressive stillness. By the end of the first day, Karen's fury turned to frustration. She tried everything, banging on the door with her fists, picking the lock with a bobby pin, even attempting to force open the side door. Nothing worked. With no phone signal and her battery gradually draining from repeated attempts to call out, panic set in. In that stifling dark enclosure, Karen cycled through every emotion: anger, denial, bargaining, and finally despair. She could not believe that the woman who had once prided herself on commanding the neighborhood now found herself imprisoned in a garage she had unceremoniously claimed. Over the next 24 hours, the situation worsened. Karen, desperate for air and human contact, tried to pry open the small doggy door, a flap meant for a pet, not a full-grown person. In her struggle, she became comically stuck halfway through the door, her limbs flailing in a pitiful attempt to escape. The image of her, half inside and half outside the door, was both tragic and absurd, a stark contrast to the domineering figure she usually projected. As the days passed, her resources dwindled. The stale snacks offered scant comfort, and the lack of water forced her to ration every drop. She attempted to use her phone repeatedly, but with no signal. Each try ended in frustration. Throughout her ordeal, she sent frantic texts to Jack, screaming, "Help me, you monster, and you locked me in, let me out." Those messages accumulated, time-stamped and irrefutable, proving that she had been trapped for far longer than a few hours. Yet, from Jack's distant vantage point on his vacation, he read those texts with a detached amusement. He had told her to be a good neighbor, and let it be, and now, she was reaping the consequences of her own stubborn arrogance. By the third day, the relentless pressure of confinement and hunger wore down her resolve. Karen's voice became hoarse from yelling, her protests grew quieter, and the occasional sob broke through her anger. In the dim light of the garage, she spoke to inanimate objects, a half-empty coffee cup, a discarded pen, as if seeking solace from something that could understand her plight. In her mind, she still believed she would be rescued. After all, she was Karen, the president of the HOA. But as the hours stretched on with no intervention, a sinking realization began to dawn on her: no one cared enough to check on her, and she was utterly alone. Back at his vacation spot, Jack was largely unaware of the full extent of Karen's misery. He occasionally glanced at his phone, noticing the desperate texts, but he rationalized that she would eventually figure it out on her own. After all, she had repeatedly boasted that her way was the only way, and now, that pride had left her stranded. Finally, on the fifth day, Jack returned home. As he pulled into his driveway with a sense of anticipation mixed with residual irritation, he pressed the remote to open the garage door. The door slowly creaked upward, and there, bathed in bright, unforgiving daylight, emerged Karen, disheveled, her hair a tangled mess, her clothes stained, and her eyes wide with shock and fury. She stood there for a moment, absorbing the sudden brightness and the reality of her situation, before erupting into a tirade. "You absolute maniac," she screamed, voice hoarse from days of shouting. "You locked me in here, I was trapped for a week, and you left me to rot." Jack stood calmly, holding an iced coffee, his expression a blend of annoyance and quiet amusement. "I told you to move your car," he replied evenly. "You chose not to, and now you're paying the price." Karen's face flushed with anger and humiliation. She tried to shout further, threatening to call the cops, to sue him, to claim unlawful imprisonment. But Jack, unfazed, pulled out his phone and scrolled through the texts she had sent, each message a record of her ordeal. He then retrieved the security footage from one of his cameras, showing clearly how she had parked in his garage, and then re-entered, ignoring his demand to leave. The evidence was irrefutable, her threats fell flat. Greg, her husband, arrived shortly after, confused and concerned by the sight of his disheveled wife. When confronted with the footage, he could only shake his head in disbelief. Karen, realizing that her elaborate claims of victimhood were crumbling, could do nothing but glare at Jack. "I'm not pressing charges," Jack said, his voice cool. "But I will be installing a new security system so this never happens again." Karen snorted bitterly. "I'll never park in your garage again, you lunatic." Jack offered a small wry smile. "Good, then we're on the same page." Before she could respond, her phone buzzed with a notification, a fine from the HOA for unauthorized use of another resident's property, and for multiple neighbor complaints. Additionally, the message stated that her community privileges were suspended for a full year: no pool access, no clubhouse reservations, nothing. With that, Karen's expression fell, and she stormed to Greg's car, defeated and fuming. Jack watched them drive away, shaking his head in quiet satisfaction. His garage was once again his own, and Karen's outrageous behavior had come back to bite her. The evidence was clear: she had trapped herself by overstepping boundaries, and now she had to deal with the consequences of her own arrogance. Over the following days, the story spread quickly through the neighborhood. Neighbors discussed Karen's mishap in hushed tones, some with sympathy for the inconvenience, others with amusement at the poetic justice. Even though a few questioned whether Jack had been too harsh, the security footage and her own messages left no doubt that she had overstepped her mark. In time, Karen became a cautionary tale about entitlement and disrespect for personal space. Greg, subdued and embarrassed, avoided confronting her further. Susan, her friend, had long since stopped defending her outrageous behavior. And Jack, he simply continued with his life, knowing that his garage, and his property, remained firmly under his control. There was a quiet satisfaction in reclaiming his space. For Jack, having a place to call his own meant everything. His garage was more than just a shelter for his car, it was his haven where he could work on projects, store his tools, and enjoy moments of solitude. And now, it had served as a stage for a lesson in humility for someone who had believed that the rules applied only to everyone else. Jack kept his security system active, and every time he pulled into his driveway, he checked to make sure nothing else was amiss. The experience had taught him that true peace comes from knowing your boundaries are respected. For Karen, the memory of those 5 long days trapped in a locked garage, complete with a series of desperate